All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Form Check Friday. As you can tell, I'm alone and lonely today, but we're gonna do the thing. We're gonna give y'all some technique reviews. We're gonna talk powerlifting. But first, I wanna give a quick shout out to our sponsor for Form Check Friday, Bells of Steel. Bells of Steel is a local company here in Calgary that produces home gym equipment at very affordable prices and ships it all over the world. They've got a showroom here in Calgary, one in Toronto, and one in Indianapolis. You've probably seen a lot of their products all over our channel, including those wonderful machined plates, the Hydra Rack, which I'm a huge fan of, and the combination pull-down seated row, which again is one of the things that I think they really knocked out of the park. So if you're looking to get anything from Bells of Steel, we'll have a link in the description box below. If you're looking to outfit a home gym, get some bars, get some plates, racks, whatever you're after, they've got it all. And I can assure you they'll have a pretty damn good price on it and multiple distribution centers so they can ship it to you for a lot less than the other guys too. So with all that being said, we're gonna dive in, and I mean, at this point, if you're watching, you probably know what we're doing here. If you're interested in sending your video in, if you want to be featured on the channel and have your technique looked at, have your questions answered, go ahead. There's also a link for that in the description below, or you could just head straight to calgarybarbell.com. You can also check out our coaching and our app and all that stuff there. And you can click the links to follow through and submit your lifts. So, first submission today is coming from Dion. Now this second squat in the video here is his opener from his last meet. It's 185 kilos. He said he failed 190 and just didn't take a third attempt. He had issues with falling backwards. So his 170 kilo warm up saved the falling backwards. He didn't end up with that issue. He's halfway through his prep, wants to be stronger out of the hole, avoid the sticking point. He said he changed his grip, learning from the past Form Check Fridays. And you know, the concept I talked about there was that a lot of the times when we bring our grip in really tight and really narrow, it creates these feelings of tightness and it bunches up the upper back and it kind of jams stuff together. But what happens is when we get into the bottom, we have to kind of change our position slightly. We end up losing that tightness. So I kind of came up with the comparison of really narrow, kind of stuffing stuff in there being a sort of false tightness or passive tightness, versus being a little wider, being able to kind of pull the bar in and create that tightness being active tightness. Now, active tightness being a little bit better. Anyways, let's take a look here, because I can see on this first one, I can see what you're talking about, where we get shifted back, right? Out of the bottom, we get shifted back. And I think part of it's coming from just trying to be too upright on the way up. And you mentioned sticking point in here as well. A lot of the times people will hit the bottom of the squat. They'll be in what I consider a pretty darn good position here. And then out of the bottom, the first thing that happens is you really extend through the hips and pull that bar back, pull your chest upright. And what ends up happening is that bar then gets behind your center of gravity, right? Throughout the first part of the squat, the bar's in a pretty darn good spot, nice and lined up, kind of right over mid-foot. Look at this, maybe even, yeah, I'd say right about mid-foot there. But see this shift backwards out of the bottom? If we watch this bar path comes down and then it comes back quite a bit. And whether that's because the knees are pulling back as a function of kind of not staying in the quads, or maybe not being strong enough in the quads, we're translating a lot of the load to the posterior chain out of the bottom, or whether it's because we're trying to be too upright. This is a rare case where we're seeing you more upright on the way up than on the way down. We descend with what I would consider a really appropriate torso angle, and then when we come up, there's a real big effort to get super upright. Now, the reason I bring up the sticking point is because when we focus more on back extension and getting upright and hip extension than we do on, just maintaining the brace and pushing with the legs, a lot of the times we run into that sticking point. It can be really pronounced when we're sort of pushing for and forcing extension out of the bottom more than we are just keeping patient and locked in and braced in the trunk and just driving the legs down, right? That little bit of patience in changing position out of the bottom can be a big difference maker. Now, I'd be interested to see your squat from the front. It looks like we're really forcing the knees out super, super hard. And if that's the case, it might be worth just kind of letting the knees track a little bit more straightforward as opposed to trying to be so externally rotated at the hip. And in a lot of cases, that can help smooth things out as well. You know, if we're forcing more extension than, you know, the body wants or needs to be going through that movement, then it could be throwing your balance off a little bit there as well. But again, we look really good on the way down, and if the way up looked more like the way down, you'd be Gucci. But what's happening is we look good on the way down, and then on the way up, you're kind of like pulling and pushing and shifting everything backwards onto your heels. So keep some toe pressure, keep those knees forward, worry less about trying to get upright, trying to extend and drive the bar back. Really common cue is to kind of like drive your bar up into the back, or sorry, into the bar. And I would say in this case, if you're doing that, cut that cue, because I think that's one of the things that's throwing you off here. Anyways, Dion, I hope that helps. Best of luck with your next competition. And yeah, let's move on to the next one here. So up next, we've got Andrew doing some bench press. And I've noticed we're seeing a lot more equipped lifting coming in. And I think that's pretty cool. So that's all. Equipped Sub Junior had a lot of success with a lower arch and a more sudden style of leg drive. So I think what he's saying is just a bit more like a jolty kind of, not necessarily consistent leg drive. Now, he's been trying to cue a big chest and bringing the chest to the bar, pulling the shirt apart. I think just trying to keep elbows out instead of over tucking, which is definitely a thing in a shirt. He says he's been seeing a lot of success with that. He's about to go through a new training block that prioritizes raw bench over equipped to help knock out some inconsistencies with his raw bench because he's been focusing a lot on equipped. Give his shoulders a break. And not only his spotter is in a bench shirt, but about 30 people that aren't in frame were all in bench shirts. They're part of what he says is one of the best high school powerlifting teams in the US. So shout outs to wherever. I wish you'd have said the name of the school or something. I would have given you all a shout out and said, you know, good luck at whatever. But anyways, a lot of equipped lifters coming up. I'm gonna guess this is somewhere in Texas because I think Texas has some pretty humongous equipped high school powerlifting sort of culture there. But let's take a look at the bench. Not sure that we got a whole lot in terms of like actual questions there. I think he said, you know, bench seems to be going pretty well, and you know, is just going to be transitioning into some raw bench to iron out some consistencies. I think the first thing I notice here is that we do see a little bit of movement in the feet, right? After the feet get set, after the bar comes out, then we're kind of moving the feet around. I would rather see lifters get their feet set before the unrack so that once we unrack, there's nothing else moving, right? We don't really want to be introducing any dynamic in pretty much anything other than the shoulder and elbow joint once that bar is out of the rack. It does look like we do a good job kind of setting the chest up, but again, I think we could do a bit more of that before the weight of the bar is bearing down on us, right? We kind of set the leg pressure, we set the chest up after we've got the bar and right before we descend, where I think, you know, if we could maintain more of it out of the rack, see we get into this good position here, keep this tension, just set the butt down, and then you won't have to set down, readjust, and then redo the tension and tightness there. It'll just allow you to consistently carry the tightness and tension you create in your setup over into the bench. In terms of the touch, there's a tiny little bit of dump, and usually what I recommend for equipped lifters is if you can get the bar to here, just wait, right? It's a really common tendency to want to like dump the bar forward and get that touch. But the way I like to think about the bench shirt is there's like a little bubble of tension right there. And what you want to do is you want to let that bar come right into the bubble because that's where the most tension, assistance, tightness, all that stuff, that's where you're gonna get the most out of the shirt. So if you can let it sink into or even pull it into that bubble, as opposed to finding the bubble and then hitting it and letting the bar roll out here to touch. Do you know what I mean? So if this is the bubble, we're hitting it, we're coming out here and touching with this little sort of dump there. What I'd like to see is maintain that upper back tension and just kind of let that bar settle in the last tiny little bit. And it will. If you're patient with it, you keep your tightness, it will get to the touch. And then you'll have a little bit less position to recover when you're getting into the press. So yeah, those would be the biggest recommendations. It sounds like you're having a good time, you're doing well, so I'm not gonna tell you to change too much. A little bit more patience, a little bit more consistency between your setup to actually, starting the descent on the bar. Next, we have Frank, actually, as I think Dylan said specifically to pronounce this lifter's name, Frank. All right, casual lifter trying a period of more focused effort to gain some strength on all the lifts. I like to think I favor a more stiff-legged style. Historically, that's been where he defaults because he feels strong there. He says he knows the flexion in the low back isn't a bad thing, but it's not consistent. Do you think I should still try to get more leg bend for quad drive, or do I embrace what feels natural for now? Any tips on the back flexion being more consistent, and anything else you think could benefit me? All right, let's take a look, Frank. So first thing I think here is we're kind of knocking the bar around as we start the lift, right? So I think right now we're setting that bar right up against the shins. Now if we watch, let me put a mark on the front of the bar's end cap there. We watch as we start, the first thing that happens is that bar has to go out and around the knees. So we end up with that bar coming out this way. What I would recommend is, number one, let's just set that bar a little more away from the shin to start with, right? Just set it right over kind of the middle of the shoelaces. I think being that close, having the bar's first movement be away from you with a heavier weight is gonna be harder to keep the bar under control for sure. In terms of the sort of stiff-leggedness of your pull, I think it's totally fine. I don't have any issue with being a little higher hipped. That's gonna be a lot more comfortable for some people. But I think if we're gonna be higher hipped, then we don't wanna be seeing the hips come up any further, right? Which I think we see in most of these. So being higher hipped is fine, but keep the hips wedged down and keep the knees wedged forwards as we start the pull so that bar's coming straight up, right? We might be very slightly out in front of the bar. I think we're actually looking pretty good. I take it back. But the biggest thing is gonna be to make sure that, I think the pivot onto the heels is gonna be another cue I'm gonna give you here, right? So right now things are kinda in line out in front of the bar, right? I think when we watch this pull come off the floor, we've got a little bit more forefoot and toe pressure than we do heel pressure. And in your case, I want us to get a little more on the heels before we start the pull. So see how we kind of pivot forward here when we're setting up? That's fine. See how we kind of pivot back here as we get into the pull? I want you to pivot back more, just a little bit more. It might mean your hips are like 1/4 of an inch lower. It might mean your knees are 1/4 of an inch more forward, but I don't want you to focus on trying to get the hips down or trying to get the knees forward, because then you're gonna lose that tension that makes things feel so natural for you. What I want you to do is just keep pivoting back until you get a little bit more weight on your heels, and then I think it's gonna smooth your deadlift out. As we get through to lockout on a lot of these reps, we end up just coming too far forward. And I think this rep is a great example of that. We lock out and we're pretty far forward over the bar. We really went to the bar instead of pulling the bar to us. And a lot of the times that's a function of just being a little too far forward on the foot. In terms of the back, flexion, extension, and all that kind of stuff, I would say there are reps where you like try to extend, like this one, and there are reps where you extend less just by nature of how you kind of pull in and brace. Seems like you're kind of worrying about it less. Like this one. This one to me looks like a better brace, right? We've probably got a little bit more anterior tension, a little more tension in the front of you. And it looks like we're getting more of this kind of compression, right? where it's like we're trying to create this tightness between the pelvis and the ribs. We're trying to fill all this in just with tightness, trying to pull these two structures together. Whereas on a lot of these other reps, I think what we're doing with our braces, we're trying to drive the chest out. We're trying to be like artificially sort of more extended than we need to be. This rep, we actually also sit the hips down a little more too. And then before we pull, everything kind of shifts back forwards over the toes, right? So the bracing here was great. There we go, getting into the right rep here. The bracing was great, right? I like this little bit of flexion. I think that's the right thing for you. I think it's gonna put you in the tightest, most efficient and consistent pattern. I just want us to pivot a little more, like the tiniest little more onto the heels, so we have a nice sort of even foot pressure between front and back. And then, yeah, just try to maintain that foot pressure. Try to be really patient off the floor so we're not letting the hips come up behind you. We're not letting the bar kind of pull us out of position at all. And then with lockouts, just make sure you're holding your lockout for a second, right? I think in some of these later reps, we're thinking too much about trying to pull back. We're trying to do too much with the back and hips, just even from the start of the lift, and then it starts to get kind of slow and awkward off the floor, where I think I just want you to just imagine just pushing the floor away like a leg press, right? Pull into position. Position looks really solid here. Just push. Just push. Once the bar gets to the knees, then we can start thinking about applying a little bit more hips, applying a little bit more lats to kind of, you know, get that hinge between hips and back through to finish. Yeah. It's okay if the knees straighten a little bit before the hips, even in a conventional. All right, up next we have a Bradley doing some squats here. And Bradley says the only thing progressing with his squat is knee pain. I'm an on and off lifter who's been relatively consistent for the past year and a half with aspirations of entering my first comp someday. Bench and deadlift progressing nicely, but squat numbers and bar speed are moving slow, slow, slow. What's worse, as I improve, my knees seem to bother me more and more until he takes a significant amount of time off to heal, which resets progress. Ortho said I'm fine and I'm just getting old. Thanks, bro. Appreciate your overall advice on form as well as any tips to lessen the impact to the knees through form programming accessories. Self-diagnosis on form, he would say, stop looking in the mirror, try weightlifting shoes for the heel, and learn low bar. PS Form Check Friday is probably the single most helpful free educational offering on powerlifting on the entire internet. Watch every week. Thanks so much. Cool. Thanks, Brad. I'm glad that it's been helping you. So with the knees, I think one of the biggest things is going to be when they get aggravated, just modulate, right? I've dealt with a lot of knee issues over the last little while. I'm not sure if you follow our other content, our vlogs and stuff like that, where I talk a lot about my training, but taking time off, we're not going to desensitize things, right? We're just going to allow the sort of aggravation to lessen. We're not going to actually kind of, in some ways, force the knees to adapt to what we're doing, which is some of what we need, right? We need the body to become capable and not have those kind of adverse reactions. And the only way we're gonna have that is if we continue to do those things. So I would say number one, look at the programming, right? If we're seeing these really big drastic kind of spikes and increases in loading, whether it's through volume or whether it's through, you know, big spikes in intensity, a lot of times those are the kinds of things that will set off these bouts of pain. Unfortunately, yes, those are also the kind of things that will often drive progress. So given that we're seeing those two things coincide, right, the progress and the pain, we need to find a way to just squat for long enough without pain that we can then start layering on the things that will give us progress, right? I've seen this many, many times before. I've done it myself many, many times, but a lot of people's first reactions when they start feeling good again, when they're you know, more or less pain-free, is they start really trying to layer things on. And it can be really challenging to get the right combination or the right sort of progression when we begin layering things on. One of the ways I like to do that, sort of layering, is to start incorporating more specifically demanding exercises for the knees, right? So I will implement things like a front foot elevated split squat or a Bulgarian split squat or a single leg extension, things like that, where I'm kind of forced to really rely on the knee. And that's also going to really impact the amount of load I can use. So if you have to use a very small amount of load, you're going to have to take a long time to progress that, which is sort of exactly what your body probably needs. So, from a programming and a progression standpoint, I would say, if we're doing one squat a week and it's feeling pretty good, instead of just going straight to a second squat per week, let's layer in some other, knee movements and more demanding knee movements, more varied knee movements, and see if we can slowly start to apply more stress that way before we start jumping into, the squat training that it's going to take for you to make, substantial objective progress in terms of now my squat is more numbers, more weight, right? So now let's look at the technique a little bit. Obviously, yes, the self-diagnosis of stop looking in the mirror, that's a big one. It is probably kind of hard. You're not in a cage, you're in a rack, so it's not like you just turn around, right? The big thing I would try to do is just kind of like look down here somewhere so that you can, put your eyes. A lot of those mirrors cut off around like between knee and hip height. So if you can just look at the joint or the seam in the mirror, a lot of times that can keep you from looking at yourself. The big thing, or a thing rather, that I think helps a lot with, maybe desensitizing the knees or getting a little less stress on the knees. Number one is going to be, learning that sit back, perhaps a little bit lower bar position. Those things can take a little bit of time. I think your bracing here overall is pretty good. Because we're looking ahead, we're looking in the mirror, there is a bit of a tendency for us to try to extend on the way up. But I'm guessing if most people watching are like Bradley and they watch all the time, you've seen me talk about bracing. You've heard me talk about bracing incessantly. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some other stuff. I think that if we can sort of perfect this hip hinge and work on really trying to put a lot of tension into the hips and the hamstrings on the way down, that's going to help us take a little bit more off the knees. Now, the other thing that I would actually, and I think this kind of bleeds into one of my previous points, I would actually try to find more ways to train the quads. I would find, some times throughout the week where you can do some knee extensions, some leg extensions, train the quads in like a little bit more sort of isolation. The other thing I might do is get some knee sleeves. Obviously, SBD, friend of the channel, makes fantastic knee sleeves. And, really just try to work with your programming. Get what you can in. Try not to take too big of jumps once you start feeling good. I think that's the hardest part about coming back from any injury or pain, trying to desensitize yourself, is getting to the point where you feel pretty good and not going overboard to the point where you're going to regress. And then, the biggest other thing I would mention is that you say here that you end up taking significant time off to heal. And I would say cut that out as opposed to, when things get aggravated, being like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to squat for 2 months, or I'm not going to squat, or I'm not going to do whatever. It's like, okay, let's find some other movements that I can do, right? Let's maybe push into like a 1 or 2 out of pain for the sake of continuing to use the knees, as long as the pain isn't worse afterwards. There's a lot of back and forth and sort of a lot of context to working through pain like that. But if you can find ways to do work while not making the pain worse, but keep sort of engaging the affected area, that's going to be the way through. So, hopefully that helps. And glad that you got a video on. Sounds like you're a fan of the show, I guess. We call it a show, whatever it is. Fan of the series. So, all right. Next is Mark doing some deadlifts. What do we got, Mark? So he says, hey, Calgary. Hope y'all are doing great. Problem with me is lockout issues. Not being able to produce enough leg drive, and he says he's a person who pulls with a sort of frog stance deadlift. Hard for me to reach down to the barbell without being out of position since I have short arms, short torso, but long legs. If you guys can help me, that'd be fantastic. Love the YouTube vids. Keep the grind going. All right, Mark. So, I think we are maybe just doing a bit much right now. I don't think this stance necessarily has any bearing on the lockout issues. I think the biggest thing that we're doing here is we're trying to push the hips in too far. I think if we could get the hips to sit out and back a bit more, let the knees track a little more forward instead of pushing them out too far and too hard, then we're gonna be in a way better brace. We're gonna be in a way better position with the way that the pelvis fits into the spine, right? So if we looked at this from the side, this is your spine, this is your pelvis. This is kind of what we wanna see, right? Is a relatively neutral position. What we're seeing here is, whoop, right? We're tucking the pelvis in underneath. So then we get to the top of the deadlift and we still have this kind of a thing going on, where even if the hips are locked, right? If this is the femur, even if the hips are locked, we have a lot of work to do in the low back, and the low back extensors have a lot of work to do to catch up and to get that pull done. So we got to work on trying to find a better position with the pelvis in the bottom. Part of that is going to come from loosening this dang belt, my man. Belt looks really, really tight. Looks like it's probably not only restricting you from being able to move well enough to get your pelvis into a better position by allowing you to kind of be a bit more in control of your low back and mid back, but it also looks like it's going to prevent you from being able to feel what's going on there. I think you're going to have a hard time being conscious of where you are in space and how you're positioned, because the feedback of that belt being so tight is going to throw that off. And lastly, we're just not going to have as strong of a brace because the belt is so tight. Again, it's this idea of kind of like passive tightness versus active tightness. I think, cranking the belt on there, going to make things feel really tight, but not going to allow us enough room to get air in there, to breathe, to create that tension through the abs, obliques, low back, and all the little whatever else muscles are going on in there. It's not going to allow us to get the position that we need to get, right? The next thing I'm going to say is if we have reps like this, don't do them, right? If you're having to do that kind of a lockout, you're using too much weight for that technique and for your current abilities, right? I'm not saying deload to empty bar, right? This is 405. Chances are you could be pulling, high twos, low threes, and have good, clean reps. And just do the good, clean reps. There's no point really in going up to a weight like this where you're having to do something that would be absolutely red lighted in a competition. I mean, it's cool to get a gym PR, sure. But if this is happening more often than, when we go to test maxes, then we're also just going to train and ingrain this pattern of doing things really inefficiently and in a way that's probably going to have us all start defaulting to that pattern when it comes time to actually train. So then we're seeing more and more reps that look like this. It's going to be harder and harder to do reps that don't look like this, right? Powerlifting and lifting in general is a skills-based sport as much as it is a strength-based sport, right? That's why you see so many people training with submaximal loads when it comes to the power lifts, is because there is definite value in cultivating skill. There's definite value in creating patterns that are repeatable and efficient, and that's part of why this whole Form Check Friday thing exists, because technique does matter. I've gone on record to say that the perfect technique doesn't exist, and other such clickbaity kind of things. But technique does matter. The way that you perform a lift, it may vary from person to person, right? Ideal or optimal is going to look different from body to body, but at the end of the day, each person has their own sort of version of perfect technique and their own version of what good technique is going to look like. And that's something that's, yes, it's an individual journey to get there, but that's something that you want to put intent and focus and practice into, is cultivating that ideal technique that makes sense for your body. So, with that being said, we're gonna call it a day. We wanna thank everybody for coming by, tuning in. Hope you enjoyed it. You know, if you get value out of this, share it with your friends. Leave a comment, like the videos, you know, subscribe to the channel. Check out the training app. I'm about to do form checks in the Discord this afternoon for all of our training app members. And yeah, we hope you get a lot of value out of this. That's why we do it. So let us know in the comments below if it helped. All right, peace everybody.